This conference will now be recorded.
So welcome to today's SCLF webinar, and we're delighted to welcome Paul Bardos, who's going to give us a very interesting presentation on the latest guidance from SuRF-UK. Before that, I'll just give you a reminder about our next webinar, which will be on the 26th of November by Keith Torrance on the beneficial reuse of dredged canal sediments. And I'll be putting out the meeting invite for that next week. Also a date for your diary as well for the 10th of December, where we'll be holding our AGM and a quiz, but also we'll have a talk on the new stats guidance as well. And that'll be at the later time of 4 o'clock, starting at 4 o'clock. So I'll be sending out the invites for that quite soon, because I'll also be inviting for any additional members to the executive committee to fill the vacancies that we would have coming up on that. I will be putting in the chat, as you know, we always provide the opportunity to our speakers to nominate a charity. So I'll be putting Paul's nominated charity in the chat in a minute. So have a look out for that. And if there's anything that you're able to give to that, that'd be much appreciated. So without further ado, I'll just introduce Paul. So Paul's the Managing Director of R3 Environmental Technology Ltd. And he has interests in contaminated land, waste management, renewable energy, brownfields and sustainability assessment. And he is the current chair of SuRF-UK. He's also a visiting professor at Reading University and international GSR expert for the Ministry of Environment and Ecology China, a short-term consultant for the World Bank and a Chartered Environmentalist. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Paul for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm also rubbish at running the PC because I can't get my camera to work, so I do apologize for that. Can everybody hear me clearly and see the presentation screen? Is that all okay, Alison?
Yep, we're good here, yeah.
So I'm going to give you a quick run through of the SuRF-UK sustainability assessment process and indicator guidance. It's the work of quite a lot of people, and I acknowledge the various members of the steering group on this slide. The way that I'll run the talk, and apologies for anyone who's heard some of it before, is I'll describe SuRF-UK in a nutshell, the guidance roadmap that is free to use from SuRF-UK, the context, the history, the original guidance on indicators, and how our original guidance was used, and then how we came to be re-releasing it in 2020. And the two reports that have been released, Supplementary Report 1 on process, Supplementary Report 2 on indicators. There's a lot of supporting journal publications, so there'll be a slide on that. And Alice and I'll pop you over a slide deck at the end of today so that you can circulate it to members of the forum. What I have as an annex is to go through each of the sustainability assessment headline categories one by one. So I estimate that the main part of the talk is 20 minutes, and then perhaps we could have some Q&A then, and then if people were interested too, we could go through these categories one by one and have a discussion around them. But Alison, I'd need your help because I can't see the chat box when I got the slides up.
Yeah, that's fine. What we can do is, if there's anything that's that I need to interrupt you for, I can bring that up to you, and I'll do the Q&A at the end.
That applies at any time through the talk as well, by the way. So if there's anything urgent you need to ask, please ask. So SuRF-UK is a project. It's the United Kingdom's Sustainable Remediation Forum, and it began in 2007, shortly after the first SURF in the USA began. And its goal is to advance the development and use of sustainable remediation in the UK. And although the Americans were first with the forum, we were the first country to publish a framework on sustainable remediation, which was published in 2010. So as a platform, SuRF-UK is a collaboration of regulators, industry, academics, consultants. It's run as a project by Claire, and if anybody is interested to be involved, in any of its future activities, for example, if you're interested in a sustainability assessment case study on one of your projects, or being in any kind of consultation that we run in the future, please do get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you. So at the beginning of this year, we have a roadmap of the SuRF-UK guidance, and the top of the roadmap looked like this, and it flagged at the very top are two main pieces of guidance. The framework from 2010, that's not likely to be updated because we managed to get every regulatory agency across Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland to sign the forward, and we're not sure that we'll ever manage to do that again. So I think the framework document will remain the same, but it is also technically still relevant. In 2011, we released some guidance on what might be indicators of sustainability, and we decided that needed to be reworked, and that led to a whole lot of consultation and discussions, which actually led to quite a major change in how we're presenting our guidance. While you're here, if you like, if you go to the SuRF-UK website, and you can see the link there at the bottom, www.claire.co.uk/SuRF-UK. There's a really cool little animation there. It's 3 minutes long, but it took us a year to write it. It's a long story. And it's really pitched at everybody to explain what we might mean by sustainable remediation. It's also got subtitles in multiple languages. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth a look. And if you ever need to explain to anybody what sustainable remediation is, you can do that by just taking 3 minutes out of their life using that animation. We also have on our roadmap a whole range of supporting documents and guidance. This is all freely available. So the guidance on indicators that we released in 2011, we called Annex 1 because we envisaged a series of different annexes to the framework. In the end, things didn't quite work out that way. But this was our first piece of additional guidance. And our goal was to set out a broad frame of reference for sustainability assessment to avoid people focusing on just one or two themes that they thought might give them the most useful, or well, not useful, but useful in a very small-minded way result, the most expedient result. And we divided these indicators across 15 headline categories, evenly distributed over the three elements of sustainability, which are environment, society, and economy. Within each of those categories is a more detailed listing of possible individual indicators. So they're fairly straightforward on the environmental side, and actually very consistent with the US EPA's green remediation approach. Emissions to air, which includes climate change emissions, soil and ground conditions, groundwater and surface water ecology, natural resources and waste. I'll go to the far right now on the societal side. Society is made of people, so things to do with human health and safety are the first headline category that we have in the social element. Ethics and equality, this is something that many people struggle with. What has this got to do with a remediation project? Well, it turns out it has quite a lot to do with it sometimes. For example, often impacted communities might be disadvantaged communities. And another very obvious linkage is the what are called intergenerational effects. So, for example, a remediation that's based on containment or excavation and removal to landfill is really postponing the problem to the future. So it has a poorer performance in ethics and equality than, say, a remediation process that's removing or destroying contaminants in the here and now. Neighborhoods and locality. This refers to impacts like traffic, dust, noise, nuisance. Communities, community involvement. This refers to the amenity use of the site, the level of engagement of people with the site. The fifth item, uncertainty and evidence. This is another one that often confuses people. So this is not to do with the uncertainty of the sustainability assessment approach itself, which is definitely subjective and uncertain. We cover that in process using things like sensitivity analysis. This is to do with the quality of information for different remediation options. So, for example, if you were choosing between a conventional in situ chemical reduction and a nano remediation, then you might feel there's greater uncertainty and less of an evidence base for the nano component, simply because it's been used less. So that's covering that kind of consideration. In the center, the economic categories, well, direct economic costs and benefits. This is the bottom line for the project from a financial point of view. This is what's running the project. What are the costs of the project versus what are the benefits, for example, in terms of uplift of the site value. But as well as those benefits and costs, there might be wider economic costs and benefits, tangible benefits, for example, uplift or downshift in surrounding property values. The third category is to do with employment and employment capital. Employment capital means skills and and knowledge. The fourth category is I guess our final trickiest category, induced economic costs and benefits, and we really struggled with what to call this. But very simply, this is the idea that if you improve one contaminated site, it might have a tertiary economic benefit, if you like, by encouraging the redevelopment of a second site or a third site or some other kind of economic investment in the locality. The fifth one, project lifespan and flexibility. This is connected with, for example, whether the treatment is something that is rapid and effective, or whether it's something that might have to go on for years and years and years, like pump and treat. And flexibility means whether the solution is resilient, for example, resilient to changes in economic conditions or resilient to climate change. So I've spent a bit of time on that, so maybe I hope it's a little clearer and it might save us a bit of time later in the presentation. In terms of how much this guidance has been used, by June 2020, there'd been about 11,000 downloads of the framework and 6,500 downloads of the indicator set. There were actually many more downloads of the SuRF-UK indicator report, and we suspect that's because people thought those were the indicators, but the indicator report was actually our original evidence base for indicators. Across all of our guidance, there have been thousands of downloads since 2010. The indicator guidance that the UK has brought out has been the only indicator guidance in detail for remediation projects worldwide. There's guidance on metrics for green remediation, which is the environmental element of remediation, from the US EPA. There's some guidance in the ISO on sustainable remediation, which is actually reproducing our table of headline categories with some other ideas. But this has been the only consolidated guidance. And Claire's estimate is now that it's been used in several hundred remediation projects in the UK. And we have listed a number of examples of that in a recent paper, and I give you the link for the paper later on, but it's free to download from SuRF-UK. Within this paper, we also found references to the indicator use and applications around the world, and also for different types of applications, not only remediation. So this is where we are now from July 2020. And we've replaced the guidance that we had, which was rather fragmented, with a supplementary report, which is related to the process of sustainability assessment, Supplementary Report 1, and the Report 2, which replaces this Annex, which is about the selection of indicators and criteria. And this has a detailed checklist, which is also available as a spreadsheet. So the reasons for this, for these changes, were that in our observations of the use of the SuRF-UK guidance, there were problems and questions about how we do it and what do we consider. And this is despite the fact that we had all sorts of tools and all sorts of guidance on the website. And one of the main conclusions we came to was that our information was rather fragmented. So this is one of the reasons why we've consolidated it in these two reports. When it came to the indicators, there were some quite strong opinions. There were opinions related to whether or not an indicator was relevant. And people are often quite narrow in their perspective about that. So, for example, they were considering, is it relevant if I'm just doing a remedy selection? And of course, an indicator might not be relevant at that point, but it might be relevant if you're planning a project that's a brownfield project that's going to use remediation. And people are often discarding indicators simply because the guidance that we gave them didn't really explain why the suggestion was there and what its background was.
Involves someone.
Sorry, was that a question?
No, I think it's just someone's maybe just joined by phone. I'll just try and find them to get them on mute.
Shall I continue, Alison, or wait?
No, I think just go ahead.
Okay. So we decided to provide a bit more depth about the indicators. We had a consultation, an open consultation that Claire ran in 2018 to 19. We also reviewed what was being said about us in the technical literature. We also opened out the various redrafts that we were doing to peer review. And it is a result of all of this that we've arrived at this structure. So the first report begins with explaining the role of sustainability assessment and its importance in sustainable and risk-based contaminated land management. And then it provides a summary of the process of sustainability assessment and concludes in a summary with some key points and citations. Attached to the report are a range of annexes to provide additional help. So there's an aid memoir for collecting information as you go through the sustainability assessment process. There's a more detailed discussion of qualitative assessment. There's information about making semi-quantitative and quantitative methods, an idea about using conceptual models to explain sustainability. The second report is focusing on the scope of the sustainability assessment, and it provides information about the functionality of these different indicators and the rationale behind them. And it gives a checklist as an annex, and it provides some information on how to use the checklist during the framing of the sustainability assessment. And by framing, I'll show you what I mean in the next slide, or the next two slides. So I think I've already covered this slide. So this is the sustainability assessment process as laid out by Claire, by SuRF-UK, and we identify three broad stages. The first stage is preparation, and this is about having a consistent and agreed opinion about what the decision is going to be used for, what the project is that the decision applies to, and what are the constraints and also opportunities on that project, and who's going to be involved both in terms of dialogue to carry out the sustainability assessment and the reporting, who's going to look at it. And that goes forward to a definitional stage. And the first step of that is to set the objectives of the assessment more formally, which is basically summarizing the preparation stage. The second stage is to do with setting boundaries, and an important boundary here is a system boundary. So what things are inside the scope of the sustainability assessment and which things are outside. Other kinds of boundaries that are important are one related to the level of detail. So how you handle consideration of things like machinery, for instance. So if it's going to be used on multiple sites, how do you consider its use on a single site for this particular sustainability assessment? The third step in defining your approach then is to do with the indicators. This is setting, I've used the word scope confusingly before, but this is setting the scope of the sustainability assessment. What things do the people around this project consider to be a part of sustainability? And this is what the indicator checklist supports. The fourth part of definition is really defining the methodology that you're going to use. So to collate all of these comparisons between indicators to give a consistent result. And the fifth is determining what you're going to do about uncertainties. So there might be uncertainties, for example, in the quality of information that go towards the assessment, or there might be uncertainties because, for example, different stakeholders have different opinions about what should be boundaries or scopes. So we can use sensitivity analysis, for example, as a tool to look at these uncertainties. So we could say to stakeholders who want scope A, well, look, let's do the sustainability assessment with your scope. And the stakeholders are interested in scope B, let's make a comparison with your scope and see what kind of impact that actually has on the ranking of the options that we're looking at. That process of preparation and definition is what SuRF-UK calls framing, and that travels with the sustainability assessment, whether you're beginning at the bottom tier, a qualitative assessment, whether you're going to something that's semi-quantitative, including scores and weightings, or whether you're trying to carry out some kind of a quantitative assessment, for example, based around cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness tools. The third step then is carrying out the sustainability assessment. And the way this proceeds is fairly inevitable, I guess. You make comparisons across individual criteria. So you're not trying to make a comparison about all things in the scope of sustainability at the same time, because that's simply overwhelming, and also makes it more difficult to give you lines of evidence to say why you've made a particular comparison or ranking. So you then have a number of different comparisons, anywhere from 20 to 60 or so. So how do we then collate those comparisons, for example, into 3 overall comparisons for environment, economy, and society? And how might we then look at that in a composite way for sustainability? So that's processes called aggregation, and there are different ways of skinning that cat. And when we have our rankings or our scores or our quantitative assessments, how are we going to interpret those? We need to decide what significance is. So, for example, if it's a qualitative assessment, then you're likely to end up with something that's a ranking, which says that one for over 3 options, say, you might have one which is best, one that's in the middle, and one that's worst. But you can't interpret further than that because you don't have any scale. You haven't got any kind of metric or measurement. So that's why people might then be interested to go to a semi-quantitative or a quantitative approach. Although, to be honest, the experience of SuRF-UK and some of its members is that you probably only need to make a semi-quantitative or qualitative approach in 10% of cases. But there are some consultants who prefer to go straight for a scoring approach, like a multi-criteria approach, because they just feel more comfortable with scores and weightings. The 4th step of execution then is this uncertainty assessment, and our suggestion is to use sensitivity analyses. And then all of the information is weighed up and you draw the findings for your sustainability assessment. Now, it's often an iterative process and is refined as required. Because sustainability is subjective, there are no pounds or kilograms of sustainability. Even in a quantitative method, there are so many assumptions and approximations and estimations that underlie it that it's highly subjective. So one way of improving its resilience is to include more stakeholder opinions. So, for example, trying to get a local authority or a regulator engaged with the sustainability assessment process, or trying to get some comments from some other group of stakeholders that are the ones you're seeking to persuade. Of course, it's not really fair to go to them with a blank sheet of paper. So what tends to happen is that a small working group, i.e. the site operator and his consultant or her consultant, make a first version, an Aunt Sally, and then they go to the consultation with other stakeholders using this Aunt Sally. And these other stakeholders might say, well, you didn't consider X, you didn't consider Y, so then that might revise, for example, the definitions. Or it may be that there's a particularly crucial piece of information that needs to be revisited that affects the findings. This sounds like an awfully complicated and difficult approach. It isn't. Once you got the hang of it, for a qualitative sustainability assessment, you can probably do that over one web meeting with the core team, and maybe a couple of web meetings with wider stakeholders. It doesn't take a lot of time, maybe 1 to an absolute maximum 2 working weeks, assuming that you have the information you need for your site. And a lot of that should come from the site characterization and the general information already existing about a site. So moving on to the Supplementary Report 2, that's focusing on this bit, which was identified at an early stage as being the most tricky thing to do. And SuRF-UK wants to encourage a wide-ranging consideration of what is in sustainability. We think this improves the robustness of decisions. It improves the transparency of assessments. Having a checklist of indicators further improves robustness because people can benchmark what you've done against this original checklist. And I'll show you the process for including and excluding indicators shortly. And this benchmarking improves the transparency of the whole process. And our idea is that once you understand and agree with the stakeholders for a site, what are your key individual indicators, then that framing can move across different tiers of sustainability assessment. And by tiers, SuRF-UK means tier 1 qualitative, tier 2 semi-quantitative, tier 3 quantitative. So there are also a range of almost philosophical things that underpin this indicator guidance. SuRF-UK wants to avoid false quantifications. So often people are faced with a life cycle assessment or a carbon footprint or some other kinds of numeric information, and simply by virtue of it being numbers or a multi-criteria with scores and weights, the numbers make it all seem a lot more persuasive. But we want to bring people back to the actual qualities that are being compared and avoid false numbers that can be misleading. Equally, the approach that SuRF-UK is putting forward for its indicators is avoiding being prescriptive. We're not making one list of indicators written in stone that has to be used for all sustainability assessments. Each site and project is unique, and so we think users should determine their own scope for their own purpose. This also applies to the framing and the sustainability assessment process that I showed you earlier on. Again, we're not trying to set that in stone. Many of the service providers involved in sustainability assessment will want to innovate and sell their own know-how and IP. We just want to provide a framework that allows different stakeholders to benchmark that against good practice. And this final statement, for some people is a little controversial, but we're quite firm on it in SuRF-UK. The sustainability assessment is subjective. It's driven by stakeholder opinions. For example, the value of a landscape. It's site specific. So we feel that a prescriptive and standardized indicator set that must be used for any site for it to be SuRF-UK compliant, well, we think that's nonsense. So in 2020, our list of headlines remains unchanged except for one very, very small correction. So the individual headlines were quite robust, but what's behind them has had a bit more work. I mentioned before that the environmental element of our headlines is very similar to the US EPA green remediation concept. So that this slide's just bringing that forward. And as I say, in the annex, there's a slide for each one of these 15 categories. I'm not sure how much time we'll have to go through those. And this is the one change. It actually came from a misprint. We had the original wording was ethics and equality, and for some reason, somehow or other, in one bits of our documents, it became equity. And we concluded that that was actually a better word and a more encompassing word. I mentioned that we would go through quickly our suggestions for selecting indicators. So the indicator, if you like, is the quality, and the criterion is the basis on which you make the comparison or the decision. And there are three broad stages: considering, documenting, and finalizing. So the key considerations are, very obviously, is any particular criterion or indicator relevant for your site or project context? And when you're thinking about that, be aware that not all stakeholders will share your opinion. So try and be as inclusive as possible so that you can be confident that what you come up with, for example, in your Aunt Sally document, isn't going to require wholesale change when other people look at it. We're well aware that it's impossible to make a checklist that will have every kind of sustainability feature in it. So if there's something that's important for your site or for particular stakeholders in your site and you don't see a place for it in the checklist, then simply add a criterion that reflects this. For instance, on the site that I was involved with recently in France, this was a site which was had mercury contamination in the soils. Within the category N1 on emissions to air, we didn't have any category, any individual indicator that was related to methyl mercury. So we introduced one. You need to document your considerations and decisions. So there are two kinds of decisions. If it's not relevant, then record your decision and the rationale for it so you can explain it later on. Equally, if it is relevant, record your decision and explain why. And that also means if you're adding a criterion, record your decision and explain why. And this is a cut and paste, so see box 4. We're never going to get to box 4 in this slide set, so just ignore that. You may then need to, well, not may, you almost certainly will then need to refine the criteria. Within the checklist, we're suggesting qualities, but we're not necessarily telling you how you compare or measure a quality. That's up to you to make a decision that's specific to your case and what would be the basis for comparison that works for your project. So what are the lines of evidence that are going to support your comparison? Record what those are going to be in advance before you begin the assessment process. The checklist that's provided, there's 73 possible indicators and they're listed by each of these categories. There are suggestions of lines of evidence that could be used to support a comparison. These are not metrics, by which I mean these are not measurable quantities, but they're features or qualities that should be comparable. Sometimes, obviously across 73 different indicators, it's quite possible to have duplications in what you're thinking about. A very obvious example might be air emissions to air, where you might be considering ozone, but ozone might also be, ground level ozone might also be a consideration in the third societal category, neighborhoods. So you have to decide which category you're going to make the consideration in. So we provide some cross-references to try and help users avoid duplications. Since we published our original guidance in 2011, the UN published its Sustainable Development Goals. So the checklist also suggests what each individual indicator might link to within those Sustainable Development Goals. And we also provide the wordings for those Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the offer. The concluding remarks are there's not one light and truth, in our view, that defines how sustainability assessment should be carried out. And we're offering guidance. We're not offering obligation and prescription. Something that I didn't mention earlier on, but is fairly evident, is that structure can determine outcomes. So we have this structure with 15 headlines, but it could be that for your particular project, you want to highlight climate change as a headline and demote one of the other headlines, or have 6 headlines instead of 5. We don't mind if you do that. That's whatever works for you, but just record your rationale and why you've done it, and make sure that you maintain this concept of balance across the 3 elements of sustainability. We think that this kind of guidance-based approach is optimal for work in the UK and seems to be used quite a lot elsewhere as well. But how it's used outside the UK depends a lot on the regulatory policy context and culture. And I'd be bound to say that that might also affect how it's implemented for projects in Wales, England, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. There are differences in regulatory and policy context, and that might therefore affect how the sustainability assessment is carried out. I'll conclude, because it all seems a bit like wibbly wobbly, and when you can do what you want as long as it follows our guidance. But if you're not following our guidance, doesn't matter as long as you explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. Well, I guess that's true. But where we are firm in our opinion is that there's no such thing as an objective sustainability assessment. This is just a tool to try and get us to the best answer that we can for a particular project on a particular site with a particular group of interested stakeholders. And indeed, some components of sustainability assessment defy quantification. Many components are dependent on the values that different groups of stakeholders hold. And of course, the whole thing is always subject to context. So if you have a short timeline on a site, then you have a very different series of options compared with a site where there's a long timeline. I think I'm going over time now, so I just want to show to you this slide with the supporting journal publications. They're all available on the SuRF-UK website. You're very welcome to download them. I will keep this, I say thank you for listening to me. The Annex looks like this. I'll just keep that in the slide deck that I send to Alison. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Or if anything you want to follow up, please don't hesitate to email me. Thank you, Alison.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop the recording now.